Good evening, and welcome to tonight's event, Dante, the Art and Science of Light. This evening's talk is part of the Dante season, presented by the Humanities Cultural Programme and powered by Torch, the Oxford Research Centre in the Humanities. My name is Margaret Kean, and I'm the Dame Helen Gardner Fellow and Tutor in English at St Hilda's College in Oxford. We're bringing you this event online from the historic Holywell Music Room in Oxford, and I'm thrilled to say that we have been joined by a live in-person audience this evening. Just before we start, I'd like to remind the online audience that you can share comments and questions for our panel in the live chat in YouTube. And for the in-person audience, you can ask in the normal way by raising your hand, and then one of the team will bring you a microphone. So, on to our speakers this evening. I'm delighted to introduce them to you. Firstly, Professor Martin Kemp, who is an emeritus research professor in the history of art at the University of Oxford and an honorary fellow of Trinity College, Oxford. He's written and broadcast extensively on imagery in art and science from the Renaissance to the present day, and he speaks on issues of visualization to a wide range of audiences, with Leonardo da Vinci being the subject of a number of his books, including the semi-autobiographical Living with Leonardo that came out in 2018. Martin has published on imagery in the sciences of anatomy, natural history, and optics, including the science of art, optical themes in Western art from Brunelleschi to Seurat, and most recently, Visions of Heaven, Dante, and the Art of Divine Light. Educated at Windsor Grammar School, Martin then trained in natural sciences and art history at Cambridge University and the Courtauld Institute of Art, University of London. For more than 25 years, he was based in Scotland at the University of Glasgow and the University of St Andrews, and between 1993 and 1998, he was a British Academy Wilson Research Professor. He's also held visiting posts in Princeton, New York, North Carolina, Los Angeles, Harvard, Montreal. Professor Kemp has curated and co-curated a series of exhibitions on Da Vinci and other themes at the Hayward Gallery, the Victoria and Albert Museum, and the Barbican Art Gallery in London. More recently, he's broadcast extensively and presented concerts with orchestral groups and the solo voice ensemble Il Faglini. Our second speaker is Professor Simon Gilson, the Professor Simon Gilson, the Agnelli-Serena Professor of Italian Studies and Fellow of Magdalen College in Oxford. He has published extensively on Dante, Dante's Reception, and Renaissance Italian literary, intellectual, and cultural history. He's the author of Medieval Optics and Theories of Light in the works of Dante, of Dante and Renaissance Florence, which has just been translated into Italian quite recently, of Reading Dante in Renaissance Italy, Florence, Venice, and the Divine Poet, which came out from Cambridge in 2018, and he's the co-editor of the Cambridge Companion to Dante's Commedia. Simon's taught at the universities of Birmingham, of Leeds, of Warwick, and of Keio in Japan. He was the joint senior editor of the journal Italian Studies from 2011 to 16, and has been an elected council member of the Dante Society of America. He's the general editor of the monograph series Italian Perspectives, published by Legenda, and he's the chair of the Society for Italian Studies. We have about 40 minutes to listen to the conversation between our two experts, and at the end of that time, we'll be opening up the discussion to the audience, both online and in the room, for questions. So we're going to open with Martin, who's going to give us a little bit of a framework on the illustrations, and I'm going to sneak off out of the way.
Thank you. Just to give you some idea of the background to this, the obvious background is Dante's 700th. The thematic issue about how do you handle divine light within a naturalistic context is something I've been interested in as a sort of underground interest. And the Dante allowed me to erupt it into the public domain, as it were. Another theme that runs through the discussion is the paragone, the comparison, which became something of a courtly game, in a way, of the various practitioners of art, sculpture, music, painting, poetry, each arguing for their superiority. Leonardo famously, and may have been the pioneer of it, argued that painting was superior to all the other arts, though he had a bit of difficulty with the music. It's a question as to what can poetry do and what can painting do in this context, which is better adapted or which better works with the issue of divine light. And at the end, I look back at the unknowns which Dante is so great at, the unknowns of sublime light, and align them with modern physics, where it's the sublime darkness rather than the dark matter, but the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns. So there are these various big things running through it. They're very much triggered by Dante, and the fact that he can trigger these kind of themes is an indication of the extraordinary reach and quality of what he did. Just to put the issue at its simplest, in a way which almost seems sort of pre-art history, like 101 art history, Simone Martini on the left and Piero della Francesca on the right, the Annunciation. One in the 14th century, it is obviously a divine event, portrayed in a divine manner with gold letters pouring from the angel's mouth. So the fact it is divine light, it's a divine setting, is perfectly apparent. Piero della Francesca and Arezzo, the Annunciation, what does he do with divine light? God the Father sort of shuffles the Holy Spirit down into the space. The strongest light is the pillar, the rod going across the window there, with quite a strong shadow, but it's not divine light. The strongest light is a naturalistic light, not a divine one. As we will see, Piero had all sorts of ingenious solutions for getting round this, though he doesn't particularly do so in the Annunciation. In the book, I go on to look at the Baroque painters, above all Giovanni Battista Gauli in Il Gesù, the worship of the holy name of Jesus. And these become, for me, in a sense, the supreme Dantesque paintings, but I'm not going to be looking at those in this context for reasons of time. Of course, to see what I say about them, you have to buy the book. And I hand over to Simon to introduce Dante via two images, Domenico di Michelino in the cathedral in Florence, on the lateral wall of the cathedral of Dante standing, and then from Giovanni Di Paolo's brilliant illustrations in the British Museum for the Paradiso, the story of Dante's exile. Anyway.
Thank you, Martin. Well, it's very nice to be here and to be talking about Dante Light, Dante's scientific interests, his visual interests, and the reception of those interests too. And Martin's book is a quite spectacular visual way of looking at those issues afresh and reading about those issues afresh. So here we have Dante, the great, probably one of the greatest exiles in cultural or literary history. The Michelino image comes from another anniversary year, 1465. Dante outside the walls of Florence, holding proudly and sternly that melancholic-looking Dante with the laurel wreath, holding his commedia, his comedy. Remember, it doesn't become Divina Commedia, the Divine Comedy, until later in the 16th century, explicitly on title pages. And with the opening words of Inferno present there at that point. And the three realms of the afterlife that he writes about in exile, the comedy written between probably 1307 and just before his death, literally made it, emaciated, worn out, tired, scattered all over Italy by exile, finishing the last cantos of the Paradiso in 1320, 1321, just before his death. Florence has actually erected a platform so one can view the Michelino fresco better during the anniversary year. The second image there showing us Giovanni da Paolo at two moments, both the ejection, a more forceful ejection of Dante from Florence, and then Dante in exile in Verona, Ravenna, composing the poem in probably what is a more idyllic, restful state than the reality of exile at that point. What I want to do, I mean, really I'm setting up Martin to talk properly about images, but I want to talk a little bit, and it ties directly into the early chapters of your book, about what light and vision and optics meant for Dante. And I think probably one of the more remarkable things that maybe we haven't spoken enough about in the anniversary year is the way in which Dante draws together as a poet so many intellectual and scientific and theological interests and puts them to the service, and that's a weak way of describing it, puts them to the service of the most remarkable narrative poetry that one could possibly imagine. And so the Convivio, and again, the slide is also from Giovanni di Paolo, Dante and Beatrice, in the later stages of the journey. It's a celestial flight through the third realm of the afterlife, the Paradiso, imagined as journey through the 10 heavens of the Christian / Ptolemaic universe. Here at the Primum Mobile, the ninth sphere, and Dante gazing into the effulgence at that point with Beatrice. You see an earlier passage from Dante's, one of the early works that Dante wrote in exile, the Convivio, a kind of encyclopedic self-commentary on some of his vernacular verse. And the passage here, again, he's commenting on one of his own earlier canzoni, his own lyric compositions, Amor che nella mente mi ragiona, and note the emphasis upon light, upon the eyes, upon the way in which Beatrice acts, Beatrice, his love, his guide in Paradiso, the young girl that he describes in the Vita Nuova, their first encounter at 9 years old. Beatrice overwhelming his eyes, transmitting light into them, and Dante here in the allegorical commentary on the Convivio, transferring this to his intellect being overwhelmed. The Italian word there is soperchiare, to overwhelm, yeah, and that's a key word for Dante. Again and again, and Martin has a whole chapter on dazzling and blindness in the Paradiso. The Paradiso is all about light, all about dazzling and blinding of Dante, the protagonist. What's important too, and again, here's another passage from the Convivio, is the precise, deep technical knowledge that Dante has of contemporary science. And again, Martin's book is an excellent way of giving you a strong sense of the cultural and intellectual traditions that Dante inherits. Above all, Islamic science, which was really absolutely state-of-the-art for optical science, a figure above all known as Al-Hazm to the Latin, or Al-Hazm to the Latin West, Ibn Al-Hazm, wrote a work which was known in Latin as the De Aspectibus, that is an incredibly intellectually rich, comprehensive treatment of what vision means, right from the way in which light and colour are arranged geometrically in the atmosphere, through its transmission into the eye, and then its processing, what we would call post-sensory processing, into the brain, to become objects of conception, objects of thought. And here we see a fantastic passage, again, from Book 2 of the Convivio, where Dante is describing very, very precisely the straight-line transmission of light rays into the center of his eyeball, his pupil. They're imprinting upon his imagination, that faculty that receives them and is beginning to kind of juggle the various images that are coming in from sight and from the senses. But of course, the passage being Dante is also a passage that is about love, about Cupid's firing of the bow, about the ballistics of love. And he's also echoing a whole love lyric tradition here in which the lady gazes and shoots out eye rays, or the lover shoots out eye rays too. In Dante, the imagery is dealt with in terms of a movement into the eye, an intromission, not explicitly an extromission as such. But it's a fantastic passage. Martin may want to come back to it later. The image on the left-hand side is taken from a print edition of Al-Hazm's work. Martin, you may want to comment on the Cupid.
We should say, that's Parmigianino, an absolutely lovely image, and he's making his bow ready for action and saying, just you wait.
So never has Cupid's arrow been so technically precise. We're talking about an Italian work of 1306, 7, 8 at this point. Just give you a quickly, a couple of ideas of how vision is then represented in the Commedia. So it's the interest in how the eye works through Dante, who's the main living character in the poem himself, and through his movement through the poem and the kind of objects of vision that he encounters as he moves. Here, we're deep in hell. We're in murky conditions. Yeah, it's very, very dark. The simile at the bottom compares it to the nebbia, a thick mist or cloud in which the human eye struggles to see things because vapors are all around, and it needs to kind of work through that mist to be able to see things properly. What's being described, Dante is moving along a plane towards what he thinks is a city, towers, peering out of a well-like structure. He doesn't know that this is actually an optical illusion, a visual error. Yeah, and his guide Virgil. So Dante says, "Maestro, di che terra è questa?" He's asking Virgil, his guide, "What city is this?" And Virgil says to him, "No, Dante, you've got it all wrong. Yeah, you're going through you're viewing things through the darkness, le tenebre, troppo dalla lungi, from too far off. And because of that, avviene che poi nel immaginare aborri." What that means is your imagination is making mistakes. It's getting things wrong. We're going back to the imagination again from earlier. Virgil goes on to say, "You'll see properly, tu vedrai bene, se tu ti congiungi, quanto il senso si inganni di lontano." You'll see if you move on how much the senses make mistakes from a distance. So again, really, really precise, visually naturalistic narrative with optical illusions, the problems of optical illusions embedded within the passage at this point. A second passage from the beginning of Purgatory II, in a different kind of environment now. Now, hell, there are a few light sources. Martin, you do have a couple of pages on hell, but of course the book is all about Paradiso. A second passage from the beginning of Purgatory II, we're beginning to inhabit a light-filled realm at this point. And this is a description of the way in which an angelically piloted ship of souls is being brought to the shores of Mount Purgatory. Dante is kneeling there with Virgil at his side as the ship approaches. And this time it's an object moving towards Dante's vision. But again, Dante is extremely careful as a narrator to pick out the phases of movement, of distance, of change in perception, of the early morning vapors that are obscuring slightly that sight at that point. So he sees a light coming through quickly over the sea. Un lume per lo mare venire si ratto che il mover suo nessun voler pareggia. So a light that moved through the sea so quickly that its movement that couldn't be compared to any kind of flight. Yeah, and then his eye, l'occhio, ebbe ritratto. Yeah, he managed to kind of gaze down, almost make a portrait out of what he's seeing, and he sees that light again. Rividili più lucente e maggior fatto. He sees it brighter still, so the light is coming closer to him. It's almost like a kind of a focusing in. Then from every side he sees a white color, so we get from light to color, the movement of the light towards him, and then gradually he begins to see the wings and the fact that this is an angel, a divine bird, uccel divino. And it becomes so bright, più chiaro appariva, che l'occhio da preso non lo sostenne, that it came up close and my eye is completely dazzled and blinded. And Martin dwells in one marvelous, it's beautifully entitled chapter, Dantes Dazzle. He puts together all the passages, and there are so many of them, it's really difficult to choose them. And, it would be a question for you, Martin, from me, just quite how you managed to choose them. Here's a passage from the beginning of Paradiso, where Dante, again, now guided by Beatrice, is sun-gazing. He's gazing up at the sun, yeah? He's gazing up at the sun, and he's empowered by that gaze at the sun. He fixes on the sun like an eagle. And there's almost, again, a kind of strict optical sense of interplay within the imagery. So Beatrice gazing at the sun, Dante looking at Beatrice, then Dante gazing at the sun, and Dante then becoming kind of transhumanized, sent beyond his senses at that point. Trying to think whether we have any more. Here's a passage, an illustration again from Giovanni di Paolo, from Paradiso II, explaining how the cosmos, how the moon, how the spots on the moon, the speckled effect of the moon, forms part of an entire cosmic system. And the spots on the moon are not caused by materiality; they're caused by a higher form of formal luminescence and intelligibility that diffuses itself through the cosmos, is brighter at its source in God and in the source of all being, and becomes less bright as it stretches down. And that helps to explain why the moon's surface is speckled. So not material causes, but spiritual ones. And again, tying in very nicely with the way in which Dante is superbly naturalistic, but also pushes beyond the naturalistic at moments too. Within this, and we can talk about it later if you want, but I want to end here, Dante actually constructs within the narrative an experiment to disprove the moon being having material causes for this spottiness. That's the central feature of the three mirror experiment. Tre specchi prenderai, Beatrice says to him. You take 3 mirrors and you put one here and one there, and you'll see how stupid you are, Dante, at this point. And she's very, very stern with him. Yeah. Martin, I want to hand back over to you at this point.
It's a lovely passage, that one that's being illustrated, because Dante sets up an experiment, Sperientia, I think he calls it, and Beatrice says, your experiment doesn't work, but in fact it's not worth thinking about experiment, because experiment won't solve the problem, because as Simon has said, it's divine conceptions that we're looking at, and not experiments which provide the source of your wisdom, as she says rather dismissively. So all the empirical stuff is no good. The great vision towards the end of Paradiso is the sempiternal rose, these great petaled structure, this great rows of rose thrones. And he looks at this with its extraordinary dazzle, its extraordinary light. But he also says that although Beatrice, his guide, is seated a long way away, she doesn't look smaller. The perspective no longer operates, which of course the optics simply doesn't work there. And he says the full extent and nature of the jubilation, nearness and distance, add nothing, take nothing away, because God governs without an intermediary. Natural law holds no sway. And the Paradiso is full of effects which don't obey the rules. It's a different spiritual realm. I spent much of my career looking at perspective and at works of art which disobey rules, and this is the other side of that particular coin. I'm also working on an exhibition in Cambridge of David Hockney, who spends a lot of time demolishing perspective. So it's only just occurred to me this moment that there is actually an affinity between the David Hockney show and what we're doing here. And this is the last of the illustrations. He doesn't show, Giovanni di Paolo doesn't show the supreme unseeable vision at the end of Dante's Revelation, but this is the central image of the Virgin radiating divine light. You can use gold rays. The Virgin's drapery has got lots of little spots of gilding on it, so she glows in this particular way. And obviously an artist who uses gold has got this as a resource. It's reflective, it's bright, it conveys the image of divine light. Giovanni di Paolo is working in the 15th century. He overlaps with Leonardo, believe it or not, but he's working in a Sienese tradition, which is still very much wedded to this late medieval, if one wants to characterize it rather crudely, mode of illustration. And the last point, he doesn't illustrate this at this point. My high imagination failed, l'alta fantasia. The imagination just isn't up to it. Anyway, that's the essence of the problem that any illustrator of the Paradiso faces is that light is not behaving in an orthodox way, and it's too bright to be seen by normal faculties. I start this with a rather straightforward juxtaposition. Again, this is like Art History 101, with Giovanni di Paolo on the left. I suppose that is about 80% gilded. It's a large altarpiece, and it's more or less contemporary with the image on the right, which is Piero della Francesca's Madonna, which was in Senigallia, now in Urbino. Urbino will feature. And obviously, if you're using the gold background, the gold adornments of the Virgin, then that takes it into a particular realm of divinity. For what we have here is a Virgin child and two rather stately angels standing in a very nice Renaissance interior. But Dante manages to smuggle in divine light, even in this naturalistic setting. You can see a beam of light, a rays of light streaming in the windows. The passage of light through glass and through the air without altering it was taken as a symbol of the Virgin's virginity. But if we look at the beam more closely, we will see there are lots of little tiny bright impasted spots, little motes in the air, little grains of dust. Leonardo called them atomi in the air. And this was in Ibn al-Haytham, it was in Ptolemy, and it becomes an observation which recurs. The dust stirred up in a room which materializes the light in terms of these little tiny, virtually one hair brush, little dots to compose this beam of light. And Dante uses this image to create a cross. He sees a nebulous cross glowing, presented by these atoms, by these little motes. From side to side and from top to bottom move the lights, sparkling strongly as they met together and passed. Thus are seen, straight and twisted, swift and slow, changing appearance, bodies of minute dimensions, moving through the rays of light, which sometimes streak across the shadow, which for our protection, human ingenuity and skill produce. The things produced by ingenuity and skill are the shutters to shutter down the window. And of course, if you have a small gap or a space, a hole in the shutter, you can see these little motes leaping there. It's lovely. This is a bit of observational science, a bit of optical science, with the metaphor and the Dantesque reference to the cross. Simon mentioned this extraordinary ability to combine intellect and fantasy to provide theology and science. It's very Leonardesque in a way. They do it in different ways, but that ambition and achievement is very much shared. If you look at Piero della Francesca, look at this relatively small painting, which is the masterpiece of perspective in the Renaissance. It's dogmatic, perfect perspective, done with incredible projective care. And you think, well, this is a masterpiece of geometrical optics, but look in the coffered area, the ceiling compartment above the pagan statue on top of the column in which Christ is being flagellated. You'll see a sudden radiance of light there. And if you look to the coffers on the left, the compartments on the left, you can see the angle that this light is coming from. And it's coming from exactly the position halfway back in that loggia or that praetorium that Christ is looking at. So there is a light there which comes from another source, invisible to us in the picture, but we can see its effect. And none of the other figures see it. And this idea that divine light, vision, needs some sort of special intervention for ordinary people to see is a very Dantesque motif. Piero, a very smart artist, wrote a book on the 5 regular solids, but a book on perspective, and educated compared with many artists, and very clever. And in the frescoes in Arezzo, and we've already seen the Annunciation from Arezzo, a very brilliant demonstration of, again, divine light in relation to other sources of light. This is the dream of Constantine before the Battle of Milevan Bridge. And to beat Maxentius, he is recommended to go into battle under the sign of the cross. And here are the battle tents in the day before the battle, and a kind of jet-powered angel comes down holding out and pointing with this little but incredibly bright cross. But who sees the vision? The person who sees the vision has got his eyes closed. It's Constantine. None of the other figures, the page sitting at the base of the bed or the soldiers, see the vision. So again, it's one of these privileged visions in which divine light doesn't obey the rules. It goes through somebody's eyelids. When we come to Michelangelo, you'd think that somebody who is so Dantesque as Michelangelo would pay a lot of attention to divine light, but paradoxically he doesn't. He does, of course, in the opening scene, the earliest scene in the Sistine Chapel, where God separates the light from the darkness and sees it as good. But this is a narrative context. Elsewhere, Michelangelo uses light to describe human form. It's an adjunct of sculpture rather than an independent force in itself, with one notable exception, and this is a very Dantesque moment. This is the Cappella Paolina in the 1530s in Rome, in the Vatican. Relatively little visited and difficult to get into. With the conversion of Saul, or St. Paul as he is to become, thrown off his horse by the sheer violence of divine light, with the quotation that comes with it. The divine light has a physical force, blasting the figures aside and making the horse stampede. And there's a Dante quote which works absolutely wonderfully with this. I felt weighing upon my forehead a splendour much greater than before. Splendori is a glare or highlight or gleam. It's a very specific term in classical and medieval optics. So I raised my hand to the top of my eyes and made myself a shield from the sun's rays to scrape away the visual superfluity. That idea that he's trying to scrape away the light. Of course, it doesn't cast any shadow. That's what divine light does. It doesn't obey the rules. Anyway, the hero of this talk is really Raphael, and Raphael's 500th anniversary was 2 years ago, and more or less disappeared because of COVID. So this is a kind of backwards homage for it. And I'm beginning with 2 slides of Urbino, where Piero della Francesca worked. And that is his portrait of Federico da Montefeltro, the Count and later the Duke of Urbino. And this, the wonderful hill castle, which is one of the great gems of world architecture of any period or any place. And I'm introducing Urbino, as this is where Raphael was born. His father was a court artist. On the left is a Annunciation by Giovanni Santi, Raphael's father. Not bad. It's not revolutionary, but it's a very very well told story with necessary light and so on. But almost more interestingly, in this present context than Giovanni Santi being a decent painter, is he wrote a rhyming chronicle. He was an aspiring poet, playwright, and he wrote a rhyming chronicle in honor of the Duke, in which he talks about art and visual things. And one of his contemporaries, in one of the manuscript versions of this, calls Giovanni Santi a second Dante. The only thing which is really Dantesque about this is that it's terza rima, i.e. the first and third lines rhyme. But this gives you a sense of the context. It may be an absurd claim, but it's one that probably Giovanni welcomed. The one disadvantage of linking Raphael into his father is Raphael was only 11 years old when his father died, but he can hardly not have been proud and aware that his father was a literary figure. Raphael himself tried to write poetry. This is from the time of the Stanza della Sceneggiatura in the Vatican. It's sort of 1509, 1510. And there are 7 drafts, I think, of sonnets by Raphael. He keeps crossing them out. He realizes he's not getting it quite right. But again, it's an ambition. It's a sense that he also writes in a very nice humanist hand compared with Leonardo. This is an up-to-date literary hand from somebody who aspires not to be an author in a Gothic style. And Dante is the only person who appears twice in the stanza della Segnatura. The stern-jawed Dante on the left, accompanied by Homer and Virgil. Dante with his olive leaves, the olive crown of the laureate poet. And that's in the Parnassus, the assembly of the poets under the watchful eye and the leadership of Apollo. And on the right, the Disputa, with Dante appearing with the theologians. So Raphael has absolutely got it, that Dante is a poet and a theologian, which indeed he is, and above all in Paradiso, which is full of very sophisticated theology. The Disputa itself, we see that Raphael is beginning to think, how do I deal with divine light? He resorts to a mixed solution here. He's still using the tooled gold, but he's beginning, if we look in detail, to see that there are a solution which he much likes and adopted, these nebulous cloud putti, which are seen and unseen. In Dante we've got, and Simon illustrated one passage of this uncertainty of seeing, of something which glows, is there but not there. And these cloud putti very much do that kind of job. Probably invented by Fra Bartolomeo in Florence, but it's Raphael who really makes them work. And above all, in the Sistine Madonna, not too long after the Disputa, where these cloud putti begin as relatively tangible cloud putti on the fringes of it, and then bleach into this amazing glaring light. The painter's got a problem. You can only do white lead, you can only do the various kinds of lamp black and so on, so you've got a limit there. But somehow, by sheer control of tone and colour, Raphael manages to get Dantes Dazzle really working in a paradoxical way, because the actual light, of course, is no brighter than that of the white lead which he's using. A passage which seems to summarise this. This is not a source, but this is an example of this notion of the cloud. It seemed to me that we were covered by a cloud, shining, thick, solid, and polished, like a diamond which has been caught by the sun. The eternal pearl received us into itself in the same manner as the water takes in a ray of light, yet remains entire, a symbol of the virginity of Mary. But this is, I think, in the moon, isn't it? It's in the heaven of the moon, and this miraculous, intangible, indiscernible glare, radiance, which Dante is such an absolute master of. And probably the Raphael which does most in the respect to light, probably the best poetic evocation of light in art from the Renaissance and maybe from any period. On the left, you've got deliberately types of light. You've got the light of a moon with a little bit of cloud moving across it. You've got one of the soldiers has been aware, and this is a later part of the story, the narrative actually doesn't go left to right, it rather goes middle, right, left. One of the men has had some glimpse of the divine light. You've then got the taper, and you've got the dawn, the coming dawn. So Raphael is outlining different sorts of light in a very optical way, saying each of these is its own kind of light. And then in the middle, you've got this extraordinary eruption of light as Peter sleeps in his changed San Pietro in Vinculis, the Della Rovere church in Rome, with the grid used to cast the angel's brightness into extra intensity, extra luminosity. And on the right, as the bewildered Peter is conducted, much to his surprise and bewilderment, out of his chains, out of his prison cell. The soldiers there don't realise. They're like Piero della Francesca's soldiers. And Raphael surely was thinking of Piero della Francesca in the sense that these armoured figures are characterised with enormous virtuosity in terms of shine, but for all the luminosity of the light, they don't actually don't actually see it. Zooming in here as well, that's the drawing for this doesn't have this grid on it. It doesn't have the grid of the prison cells, and it occurs to me that Raphael, to take the drawing, he would have squared it up. The way you took a nice little developed study was to put squares on it, and you then squared it up in the bigger scale in the picture. I'm wondering, this is a little bit novelette-ish, but I think it's rather tempting. Did Raphael look at his squared drawing and think, that will solve the problem of getting this light really to vibrate? The painting of the soldiers is very Piero della Francesca light. The light on the armour, in a sense, simplifies the figures. From big scale to tiny scale, the Vision of Ezekiel is about a foot across, for those of you dealing with old measurements, as I still do. Tiny picture, yet with extraordinary monumentality. The Vision of Ezekiel, the four symbols of the evangelists, the angel, the eagle, the ox, and the lion, bearing God the Father, this vision of God the Father that Ezekiel has. An explosive and very effective vision, but once we think about the space of it, it becomes very strange. In the bottom left-hand corner, there's a ray of light pinging through the clouds and hitting a tiny little figure, no more than a millimetre or two big, who's got his arms raised up. That must be Ezekiel. The vision is getting there. Then we think, look what's happening with the cloud. It's behind the tree. It's not near us at all. So that is an absolutely enormous vision. It's spaceless. There is no orthodox perspective there. There's a contradiction. Ezekiel is a long way back. The tree is in front of the cloud, though we think that the vision is close to us. So he's playing with a very Dantesque ambiguity of something which doesn't obey the laws of scale. Raphael is very smart. And the last of the Raphaels, when he left partly unfinished, not much unfinished, on his deathbed when he was 37 years old in 1520, the Transfiguration, undertaken in competition with Sebastiano del Piombo, the Venetian painter, who was being backed up with designs by Michelangelo, commissioned by Giulio de' Medici for the cathedral in Narbonne. So this is serious competition here, with Michelangelo lurking behind Sebastiano. And the Transfiguration, Raphael chooses to introduce a dramatic narrative which is after the Transfiguration in the Bible, where the disciples, with Christ still in the hill, fail to cure a mad boy. So that dramatic, rather Caravagesque event in the penumbra there, in these very sharply delineated shadows, is a failure of the disciples. Above this great radiant vision of Christ in these radiant garments, the Transfiguration, he appears blindingly. The three disciples have gone up the hill, Mount Tabor, to see him. And what is happening, as you can see on the right, is that the two prophets are already souls. They're souls in heaven, can look at Christ. They have no difficulty in seeing Christ, the radiant vision of Christ appearing in transfigured. The three disciples are knocked over physically by the brilliance of the light. Again, a very Dantesque motif, that the difference between the spirits in heaven who are part of this visual environment and the people who still carry their human senses around with them is very brilliantly realized here. And probably I can't do any better than finish with the point that we've already got to. At this point, my high imagination failed. L'alta fantasia qui manco possa. That ultimately the divine light is unseeable, ineffable, beyond any level of comprehension that we can achieve. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to grab the laptop and rejoin you. Thank you. Great. Well, that was incredibly stimulating. I'm going to say insightful just because I can't avoid the pun. I'm very sorry. But we do have time for questions. And obviously the audience is here in the room with us and also online. So just a reminder for the online audience that they can share their questions for the speakers in the live chat that we have on YouTube. And I'm going to take a look at that as we go through. And of course, those in the room can just ask you a question in a normal way. If you raise your hand, then one of the team will bring you a microphone and they will hold it for you while you ask your question. So just kind of opening it up, is there anyone with a burning question, a kind of an ardor question for Paradiso that they immediately want to ask? Can I ask mine? Mine is about translation. So you've been talking about the way in which we move from one medium to the other. But I can't help being aware of how many, I guess I'm thinking 20th century in particular, but how many creative artists, how many poets have had a go at the Inferno. And sure, Alistair Gray did manage to do all 3 books, and that's wonderful that he completed that task. But I think it would be fair to say that there are far fewer creative translators that attempt the Paradiso. And I'm just wondering whether this difficulty, this inexpressibility actually would hit any medium, or whether we think that there's something particular about the debate between, for optics obviously, the debate between the 2 mediums that you've been talking about today. I don't know, but it was kind of crossing my mind.
Do you want to go, Simon, on the language, and I'll pick up on the images?
Yeah, I mean, and I think that impression is very accurate, and it's probably not just creative translation, but also academic translations to some extent too. And probably some of it may reflect, if I can talk in these terms, a kind of commercial market for the Inferno and for the kind of dramatic encounter that comes there. But I think you're right, you're picking up on something that... But I actually think the opposite could be the case, because no section of the poem in Dante is more linguistically and syntactically and narratively resourceful. So, I mean, Dante... So trying to find words to describe things that are constantly moving beyond the senses, moving beyond human experience. But Dante has constant resource to metaphors, very direct metaphors, milking, sucking at the mother's teat, whips, fires. The range of metaphors he uses for light is extraordinary. The range of similes that he uses is extraordinary as well. So, I mean, there is a huge challenge there, I agree. And maybe it is a transference to other media that one needs. Photography is writing with light, and so the photographic is perhaps a good medium for catching some of the effects with the Paradiso. There are still human encounters, and some of those similes still have a deeply human and almost domestic tonality to them. I mean, there's an element of that still within those rays, those motes of dust with the curtains being drawn. It has a kind of, although it's a very precise, technical, high-level kind of image, it has a degree of domesticity almost. So there's all of that. There's all of that in Dante, as well as this incredible experiment with language, which I think your question is a good one, because I think there's no better way of testing one's own experimentalism as a poet than to bounce, to check oneself against the Dante's Paradiso.
Yeah, I think in visual terms it's quite a complicated situation, and there are a whole series of factors at work. One I encountered when I was doing the Paradiso, and you think, well, he keeps being blinded, isn't this rather repetitive? But somehow or other he gives this a different cast each time. It somehow remains fresh. But if you're thinking as an artist, you think, how heaven's name, literally heaven's name, do I achieve this with the medium which I'm working with? In crude terms, as so often, the devil has the best tunes. If you think, am I enthusiastic about seeing all these divine figures in their petal thrones, all looking wonderful in their white nighties and so on? it can seem rather unexciting. Tom Phillips, my friend, did an absolutely terrific Inferno and translated it himself. He didn't go as far as Purgatorio. But the stories are vivid, and the tortures are vivid. Paolo and Francesca is, absolutely God-given for as a narrative subject. So I think it is difficult. The person who really gets Paradiso is Botticelli. Botticelli knows that the extraordinary silver point drawings with Botticelli with some ink, and a few of them have been partially coloured, but they're very austere, very simple, very lyrical. They're daring enough not to portray the spirits as people walking around in civvies, as it were. So a great artist like Botticelli pulls off the Paradiso, which otherwise is terrifically difficult and very intimidating. And if the Paradiso is partly about, in optical terms, the unseeable, that's not very encouraging for an artist.
Anyone in the room feeling brave? I've got one on the live chat here. Enrico Nogueira is asking, and it's a pretty decent question, I think. We've had the Paragone, you've been speaking about it. So which one's better in representing light, poetry or painting?
Shall I go first this time? Poetry and literary expression can produce a dimension which is not realized in terms of a precise picture. So I think there's always a problem there. If when Dante describes divine light, in a sense you've got things going on in here, but you don't have to put them on a gesso panel, as it were. So I think ultimately, in evoking the unknown and the unknown unknowns, then poetry has a certain advantage. However skillful you are at suggesting transcendental brilliance, it is a material art. It's an art of things which are seen concretely. Dante's Paradiso is the art of seeing things non-concretely in a way. In that point, but it is amazing how somebody, and this goes into the area of the Baroque illusions, the Gaudi, which is on the cover of the book, how he can create this great explosion of light which somehow seems unseeable and unbearable, but I think ultimately you're struggling as an artist to do that. But equally, of course, the visual arts, as Leonardo would insist, does certain things rather well.
Yeah, I mean, Martin's answered very nicely. I mean, so the effects of metaphor, the effects of simile, the sheer lexical range of words linked to or associated with light, the way in which precise narrative situation is varied, Dante gazing at Beatrice, not gazing at her, she withholding her smile increasing with brightness. So there are kind of narrative progressions as well. The way that the first visions in Paradiso are ethereal, evanescent, almost like mirrored images at times. So Dante holds off that full effulgence. He then explains the cosmic system that's all about light. But then we start to explode with light at various points. The heaven of the sun, for example, which is quite early on, cantos 10 to 14, is absolutely replete with scenes of blinding effulgence. That's the passage. So Paradiso 14 probably has more similes than any other canto. Yeah? As Dante's trying to deal and render these things appropriately. I mean, I would say this, but I think it's quite an extraordinary achievement, the kind of poetic resources and narrative resources that he brings to bear.
Paradise is potentially rather boring, isn't it? Because people being angelic and good is a bit of an unrelieved thing. At least vices are very varied. And the stories of the people behind them are very varied. Whereas, in theory, to keep describing what in a sense is a repeated escalating vision it is just amazing, the variety he gets out of that.
Incredibly intense. I'm kind of going to push a little bit with Simon, though, just on the illustrations that we've seen this evening. Beatrice and Beatrice's smile doesn't really gain any of the lift that you have when you can read it through the different cantos, and you can get that reflected sense and the intensity and the growing ardor. And the smile's so significant. And I don't know, is that one of the things that perhaps is lost because we have to have a narrative within the illustration, so she becomes part of that narrative format? Or is it just that it would possibly be idolatrous even to be looking at her too closely as a beautiful face, or how would you paint that?
Simon should answer that, but I might preface it by saying that Beatrice's smile is in the Mona Lisa.
Oh, nice.
Anyway.
Good return.
Yeah, well, I think it's a super observation, because, I mean, Beatrice is shocking in the Paradiso in all kinds of ways. She's a woman guide. She speaks in the most elegant, learned way. She is the mouthpiece for many of the kind of fundamental messages and ideas that Dante is articulating. She's the one that puts Dante, the character, in his place constantly. Yeah. And so I think it is interesting that, and she is almost that kind of mediator for divine light through to Dante, constantly. I think it is interesting. What nonetheless it reflects is that I think certainly by the last 10 cantos of the poem, the concentration upon poetic effort, poetic intensification, poetic achievement, and Dante the poet himself is very, very strong. Mm-hmm. So although Beatrice is that kind of ladder up to that in the final 10 cantos in particular, she is fading out to some extent, even though she's still effulgent. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Martin, you want to add?
I haven't thought about this before, but it's interesting. I don't think any of the illustrators I don't know all the 20th century, 21st century ones make much of the smile, which the smile in the eyes and the convivio before. And it's very odd that you would think that an illustrator would focus in, would zoom in on her face and on this devastating beauty and this her killing eyes and her killing smile. They don't, but that's why I said rather cryptically that Leonardo gets that. Leonardo and Dante is worth a full doctoral thesis or a book. I did have a very good student who was going to write her thesis on Dante and Leonardo, and it's absolutely there, but she had a fairly useless husband, and which put paid to that, I'm sorry to say.
Real life will get in the way. Do we have any questions that are coming from the audience? So I do feel our speakers have kind of given us an absolute tour de force. And I love how many ways in which you've shown us how all of these artists, but particularly the poetry and Dante, are breaking rules left, right, and centre in this final book for the Commedia. I think that's absolutely significant and just so important to show how this knowledge of optics is incredible for this author, and then how you push the science that you have and you push it forward and stay radical.
In dealing with that, I did get a sense of how extraordinary in this way that Piero della Francesca and Raphael are. And I think Raphael is underrated. I mean, he is just extraordinary, and one of the great maker of images, one of the great narrative artists, but he's very clever. For instance, I didn't deal with this in the Disputa. You've got the arc of the figures, and you assume that the arc of the figures of the holy figures sitting on the clouds are above the arc of the people on the ground, and it can't be. because the centre of the arc of the clouds is immediately above the monstrance and the host. And the two things can't do. So the vision in the heavens actually disobeys logic. And Raphael, of course, would have been aware of that. John Sherman was the first person who wrote about it and actually said, there's an internal contradiction here. You can't have this arc of the figures sitting in the clouds being visually above, completing a semidome, as it were, with the figures below. That it's actually not consistent, because the big story of that relief is the Holy Spirit being transmitted down into the monstrance and the host. I can't think that Raphael was unaware that he was doing that. Here perspective, here your rules don't work. Astonishing.
Challenging.
Yeah.
It's one to take away and think about. I think we'll take proceedings to a close for this evening. It's been an absolutely super talk and a really fantastic evening here at the Holywell Music Room, part of the Dantes season and the Humanities Cultural Programme. I just want to say a huge thank you to both of our panellists this evening. It was an absolutely stunning conversation between the two of you. Thank you, Professor Martin Kemp. Thank you, Professor Simon Gilson. And thank you to all of the viewers that are watching at home, and of course to our audience here at the Holywell Music Room. I'd just like to ask you to join me in saying a big thank you in the appropriate non-transgressive way to both Simon and Martin, and we'll see you again.